Hello, and welcome to the Community IT Innovators Technology Topics Podcast, where we discuss nonprofit technology, cybersecurity, tech project implementation, strategic planning, and nonprofit IT careers. Find us at communityit.com. Thank you for joining this Community IT Podcast Part 2. You can find Part 1 in your podcast feed if you subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts.
Welcome, everyone, to the Community IT Innovators Q&A webinar on cyber insurance for nonprofits with Jenna Kirkpatrick-Howard from Lockton Companies and Matt Eshelman, the CTO and cybersecurity expert from Community IT. We're going to talk about how this type of insurance works, why nonprofits need it, what your nonprofit is going to be asked to show that you are doing in your cybersecurity policies and practices, and the event that you might ever need to make a claim.
So this leads to the question, since prices are going up and controls are more scrutinized by underwriters, of how much limit should I buy? And how do you even know? So we take a multi-pronged approach when we get that question. There's always good peer benchmarking. What does everyone else in my space do? So in this particular case, it's a nonprofit that does scientific research, and their revenue band is between 50 and 150. So I won't tell you that all your peers know what they're doing either, but at least you can sort of see where they're at. And in terms of retention, because a big point of conversation among the cyber insurers today is they were raising retentions. At one time, cyber policies had $1,000 deductible or $5,000. We're seeing now $25 being a standard of lowest retention available in the market. I have seen some lower, but $25,000, particularly in this revenue band, is certainly it. So if you see that here, the between 75,000 of retention and 25,000 of retention, that we're seeing a median is around 50. So in this peer group, that $50,000 retention is sort of the standard. And then if you average it among the client base. And the second question is, well, what about limits? In this case, on the low end of this revenue band, you see $5 million limit being purchased. On the high end, you're seeing 10, and the average, the median is around 5. The average is around 6.8. Good data to have. I always tell clients, don't bet on peer benchmarking, because you don't necessarily know if your controls stack up, if your training stacks up, if your revenue and your culture is not necessarily like your peers, but it's good information to have, right? One other area that I actually find more useful is what we party with someone called CyberCube, and many brokers and insurers create partnerships with similar organizations. It's an analytics tool that runs a Monte Carlo simulation of all different scenarios of cyber events. And this changes based on what's happening in the marketplace. So if I ran CyberCube today and I ran it 30 days from now for the same organization, you get a different result. But what I find interesting is that it runs all these scenarios, and at the low end, you might have a $55,000 event. At the very high end, you may have a $40 million event. That's a big delta. So it tells me, if you're looking at percentages, 85% of all of the scenarios run, an event would be less than 2.5, right? If I were looking at 95%, so think of how risk tolerant your organization is, or risk adverse, and buy within the percentile for limits of where you feel comfortable. I will say, for the most part, in my not-for-profit clients, I see limits purchased somewhere between 80 and 95%, depending on budget, depending on risk profile. But at an 80% limit or an 80% chance, if you purchased a $2 million limit policy, you would cover 83-ish% of all claim scenarios that we're seeing in the current marketplace. If you bought a $5 million, you're covering 90+% of all of the claim scenarios that we would run. So this is good information to have as you're approaching your insurance renewal and seeing various limit options and the premium cost and what retentions, sort of, if you run the simulation of all the claim scenarios, where would I fall? Another Another score that a lot of insurers use is that they will do a web test, a vulnerability test. So they won't actually go into your firewalls, but they will actually do their own sort of scan and test and provide a risk score. This is part of the underwriter's review. So you fill out this great application. On the backside, they're actually going to do their own scan and determine if they can find any vulnerabilities or threats. And that will be part of their underwriting. It's always great to know what that score is. Sometimes you can ask your insurer. Sometimes your broker might have access to something like this, but it's another piece of the pie that is my cyber score better than I'm seeing in other industry sectors? Am I above average? Am I right at average? Am I below average? So in this particular case, this nonprofit had a 600 overall risk score, and the average is just above 400. So they actually had a better cyber posture and network controls than some of their peers. There might be lots of questions in the chat about all of that information about what's happening in the marketplace, what types of controls the underwriters are looking for. How do I even determine what limit I should buy?
There was actually a good question about MFA that we'll get to here as part of the next poll question. But I think is one thing I'd love to get a sense of, and this is a multiple choice question, is just how common is cybercrime in your organization in the past years? Past 2 years, did you or maybe an organization that you're aware of have any of these different events happen? So a compromised account, that would be whenever somebody other than the kind of a primary assigned user had access. That could be also known as like a hacked account. Maybe your organization experienced wire fraud. That's when maybe some banking account information was modified or changed without the organization knowing, and funds were transferred out. Gift card fraud, maybe not as big of a financial loss, but still notable. We do see some nonprofit organizations deal with actors called advanced persistent threat actors, so kind of big, kind of state-sponsored, well-resourced hacking groups that are interested in kind of data exfiltration or just kind of spying and kind of understanding what an organization is doing. Ransomware, which we've already talked a lot about, kind of our generic malware, viruses, maybe that supply chain attack or compromise. So Jenna mentioned SolarWinds, Kaseya. These are all kind of examples where a vendor was compromised, and that led to data loss or data exfiltration for the companies that were using that vendor. Or catch-all, or maybe you're the person that hasn't seen an incident yet. So just leave that poll up here. Oops. Let me relaunch that poll. And give folks a moment here to go ahead and respond to that. And then while we're responding to that, let's see. There was a question around the MFA implementation. And this is maybe I'll add on my own 2 cents here. For a lot of the application questions, it's often a binary. It's like, yes, we have it, or no, we haven't. But are there opportunities for organizations to have some gray areas? Maybe organizations that have a lot of kind of kiosk users that don't really have access to much, or maybe they can't log in from outside of the organization. Do all those accounts have to have multi-factor authentication as well? Like what's what's the flexibility in terms of the application of some of those controls?
So don't use the application as the only communication to the underwriter. So if you answer no to something, like, do you have an MFA on every single account, and you need to answer no, having a side answer of here's the reason why, because we don't have the exposure. Our reason why is we have a compensating security measure that we're taking. That matters, because the no answer triggers all sorts of red flags. And without any explanation beyond that, it creates the worst case scenario with the underwriter. If you can create a narrative that explains why that answer is no, and we're implementing it in the next 30 days, or it's something we're exploring, or if we don't have exposure to it, that matters so much. So don't feel tied to the yes and no answers in the application. A narrative is always helpful. And we even find that an underwriting call may be worth it also to walk through an application. Underwriting calls, when you build that personal relationship with the person that's going to need to offer you the quote, there's oftentimes that human element of, I want to work with this organization because I love their mission and I think they're going to do the right thing. So I'm going to offer a quote where they maybe wouldn't have if they were only staring at a piece of paper.
Great. Thanks. That's really helpful information, I think, to hear. And I think as we can see from the poll results, let's see, am I sharing this? Cyber incidents are very pervasive. We see people responding to 30% of respondents said they'd had a compromised account, with a quarter of people experiencing wire fraud or knowing of an organization's been a victim of wire fraud, and ransomware, again, being at about 22%. So again, we just can see that, the adage of cyber incidents is not really a question of if you're going to have something, but when. And so that's why these cyber controls are so important, and being able to kind of connect the dots between why is the insurance company asking for all these things, kind of tying it back to the financial impact, I think is really helpful and helps to, build the story around why that's important.
Agreed. So we've talked about what the policy actually covers and why the prices have gone up and how much limit we should buy and how to analyze how much limit or set my retention. So the next obvious question is, what happens when the event actually occurs? And what does my staff need to know? Who needs to know? Who do I need to notify? And it's a really good question. And we oftentimes will sort of have a flow chart that we share with clients that I think helps sort of demystify the process. So every cyber insurance policy is going to have selected vendors, or you may have selected vendors that you notify your insurance carrier that you plan to work with. The first call oftentimes needs to be to a breach coach. So a breach coach is oftentimes an attorney that you've worked with, someone that you need to notify when an event occurs so that everything is held as privileged and confidential in the process. You also need to call your broker and notify the insurance carrier, because the faster you can do that, that expedites access to all of those vendors that you're going to need to help you mitigate the risk. So as soon as you find out, ideally within the first 24 hours, you make 2 phone calls, that breach coach. And if you don't know who the breach coach is, certainly the broker in the cyber insurance market. Now, I will say that this is information that we share. We have a client, they'll notify us, and we will then help them notify the insurer. And it starts that cascade of law firms, forensic advisors, any sort of monitoring services. That all happens very quickly. We see the initial acknowledgement of claim and the investigation happen. And all of that happens really fast in the first weeks, particularly if your network is down. The first goal is, how do we get the network up and running again? And so everyone's focused on that. And so that happens very quickly. Now, the mitigation and the remediation step 3 and 4 can take months and months and months and months, right? So you know what happened. You've maybe paid a ransom payment, or you've got your network back up and running because you had access to the backups. Now, how do you mitigate this from ever happening again? How do you minimize the exposure? Then how do you mitigate it from ever happening again? Those can take months and months and months. So oftentimes people think, oh, it's a cyber attack. It needs to happen fast and we need to be back up and running. And then it all stops. Well, the claims process and the incident process, it does not happen. The initial response is fast, but then there's a lot more that has to be uncovered and mitigated. And if you need to notify the FBI and local law enforcement, there's a whole host of things that that breach coach and the insurer and all the panel vendors will help you walk through. And they're really talented at this type of work. They have sadly lots and lots and lots of experience in this space. And even though you may have a pre-selected vendor of who you'd want to use for forensics or who you'd want to use as a law firm, oftentimes the insurer will say, that particular vendor that we would have maybe used, we have overloaded them with other claims that are happening. And then for this particular scenario, we would recommend this one. So that access to the insurance carrier and who they would work with on your particular scenario is really important in the first 24 hours. And then you also have that post-incident consideration. So any sort of accounting fees, if there's a business interruption that you're going to need to quantify for reimbursement, improving your incident response, because nothing's better of testing out your incident response plan than a real event. And you can maybe find where those holes are, who's hard to find on a Friday night when they always tend to happen. And so how do we have backups? And what maybe education needs to come to employees and leadership, and then any policies and procedures that you may want to approve and change. It's a very stressful time, but there are professionals and well-versed individuals that do this regularly that can walk you through this process.
Yeah, and I would just say, I think it's great to have this communicated again. So, Community IT, we're a managed service provider. We're really good at kind of the day-to-day support, but when it comes to incident response, while your MSP might be able to help identify some things or do some, kind of put out the immediate fires, the really that first call, again, going to the breach coast so they can bring in, kind of the big guns, so to speak, to really help provide those covered vendors is a great step. And I think a lot of organizations need to kind of hear that again, like your MSP might not be the first people that you need to call. If you've got cyber liability insurance, make sure that that's clearly communicated. So when there is an issue, you can bring in the resources that you already have access to.
Right. The cyber insurance policy is set up for you to access those resources. Make good use of it. I think it's always important, particularly in ransomware, there's that do not list. Like, don't go it alone. Don't try to negotiate that with that threat actor alone. There's a couple reasons not to do that. Number one, you're maybe not qualified. And two, that the team that will identify the potential threat actor, because threat actor is not going to come out and necessarily give you their name and their group that they're associated with. There needs to be an investigation, and there's a whole list of OFAC sanctioned organizations and groups that, as a U.S. business, we don't do business with. And so part of the investigation goes through, is this particular threat actor on the OFAC list? So something you don't necessarily need to do, but that is certainly part of the process. We also don't make hasty decisions around if an employee made a mistake or contributed to the incident, and how you speak to the employee and how you communicate. Make sure that you don't make some hasty decisions. Really think through and communicate with your employees and customers make sure that you're doing that in consultation with your legal and crisis communication advisors, and make sure that you're using the vendors that are available to you. It's probably not best to start Googling who helps me in a cyber attack. Use your broker, use your insurer, use the partners that you've already identified. If you don't know who those are as part of the cyber insurance, make sure that you sort of vet that now pre-event, so that you know who to call.
Can I just jump in with a quick question on a lingo that you just used of the OFAC? Can you just let us know who that is?
Office of Foreign Assets Control. So there is a list of terrorist organizations and nation states that the U.S. businesses cannot do business with. This isn't just an insurance thing. It's an all business transaction thing, but insurance carriers cannot do business or send ransomware payments to any organization on that OFAC sanctions list. So that's part of the investigation process, because sadly, a lot of the threat actors are in fact terrorist organizations and organizations that are known. And I am clearly not in forensics investigation, but there is a way based on the ransomware attack or how the information is perceived that they can actually identify the threat actor and threat actor group. So I get this question a lot, and how quickly will a carrier engage? I will say most carriers, cyber carriers, they have a reporting via email, and oftentimes it gets called in because the site's down. They will respond almost immediately. I've seen engagement within the hour it's been reported, just because of the need to quickly investigate and get the system back up and running and identify the threat actor. The process to pay or not pay a ransom is one that has a lot to do with how quickly you can get your system back up and running. Do you have access to backup? Who is the threat actor? There's a long decision tree that goes into pay or not pay that you will have lots of advisors to help you with as part of your cyber insurance vendor list. The value of a cyber policy to a nonprofit is, I personally think, access to all of this expertise that you likely don't have in-house. Because unlike other parts of insurance and other insurance policies, that it's really there to provide defense or settlement or pay for the fire loss. Cyber has a whole host. Many of the carriers have pre-breach and pre-response and training available, and there's resources available as part of that insurance policy. And then post-breach or post-attack, that access to all the vendors. So there is value beyond the contract and the premium payment itself for a cyber policy that maybe isn't available on some of the other insurances that are out there. So we talked a lot about the controls. Matt, do you want to talk about what you're seeing as good cyber hygiene and first steps that you would recommend?
Yeah, I think we've talked about a couple of those resources already, and also want to answer a question that came in, which is just what resources are out there for organizations that are looking to learn more and kind of understand the landscape a little bit better. So I will highlight the link there. Maybe we can chat that out. In terms of the guide that Lockton had, I found it really helpful to kind of map, like, why is my application asking me to do this, and then map that to the cybersecurity control. I'll also maybe put in a plug for Community IT's own nonprofit incident report. So we work with about 170 nonprofit organizations. And so our service desk responds to, hundreds and hundreds of tickets, and we take all those security incidents and lift them out and then report them back as a way that, helps us understand what's happening with small to mid-sized nonprofit organizations and the security threats that they face. And then, coming out of that, I think really get surfaced the controls that organizations should have in place, because it represents a way to remediate the risk, and also tie it back to some of the controls that we're seeing on all these cyber liability insurance applications that we're filling out, which is certainly MFA for everything now. The security awareness training, I'm really glad to see that on the list, because while I love all the technical whiz bang tools that are out there, I think fundamentally having, trained and educated staff that are able to, identify or not click on that link, be able to, have a good security culture where people can share with the IT, like, hey, this looked weird, or this strange thing happened, can you take another look at it? I think building that culture is really important to having a secure organization. So again, it's, the fundamentals of backups and patching, multi-factor authentication, I think, combined with making sure that staff only have access to what they need, right? I know that's another challenge in the nonprofit world. Everybody's doing so much already. And so it's just kind of easy to give everybody admin access, but really being attentive, I think, particularly kind of in the database world. So, everybody doesn't need to have access to all the records in the system. People should just have access to what they need. And then finally, rooting that all, in a policy for the organization so that it's pretty clear and you can have a common set of understandings to, to kind of build out all of these controls. So again, there's a couple of resources out there that I think are helpful to, again, build your understanding and identify the good policies and procedures and technical controls to have in place.
That leads us to a little bit of leftover time for questions, which we promised we would do.
Great. Well, this has all been, I think, really helpful. Let's see, there's been a couple of questions to maybe clarify what would be covered or considered covered under third-party loss. So, in an example of, you're an organization with a database of donors, that database is hacked. Kind of how far does that coverage go? If the donors are then extorted or their information is used to target them as maybe individuals, is that something that's covered or kind of where does that boundary go?
It doesn't even need to be a class action, but if a donor sues that they suffered financial harm because of your cyber event, that would be privacy liability. Also, if you have any regulatory fines, as a result, you didn't comply with certain unsolicited communications, or in Europe, it's the GDRF, or California has a number of regulations. If you didn't comply and there is a regulatory fine, that can be covered under the third party. So think of it as someone were to sue you because they suffered financial harm, or you incur fines and penalties as a result of non-compliance to cyber security laws and regulations.
Mm-hmm. And is there any coverage that would be extended kind of in the absence of a lawsuit, or is that kind of the only way that, these, kind of additional protections come into play?
Well, you still have the first party. So anything that you incur in terms of costs, there's that would be covered on the insurance policy. But the most common way, particularly in the US, is a demand letter. You receive a demand letter from a donor that says, I suffered financial harm. That would trigger the liability side.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't necessarily need to come in the form of a lawsuit, but there needs to be some sort of notification.
Mm-hmm. Let's see, we have another question, and we see this too. Where should nonprofit organizations go to kind of find a broker? We get this question where it's, it seems like the existing provider maybe doesn't understand their needs, or maybe isn't familiar with cyber. Like, where should nonprofit organizations go to kind of make sure that they get the right coverage?
Yep. So there's a couple different groups that specialize in the not-for-profit sector and the brokerage community, Lockton being one, but we are one of many. So I'm not going to necessarily make a plug, but there's also the not-for-profit Risk Management Institute, I believe is the name of it. It's out in Leesburg, Virginia, but they are a good resource for risk management tools, access to brokers, good questions that you should ask your broker, insurance questions in general, and they fully support the not-for-profit community. So they're actually a really good resource, and I can help link that organization as well.
Let's see. We have a question. We see it, in the news as well. Organization has cyber liability insurance, but whenever it comes time to settle a claim, the organization seems to get less than they were expecting or hoping for to kind of cover that. How is there a way to anticipate that, or what should organizations be aware of to make sure that they're made whole whenever they suffer one of these attacks?
Have a very strong advocate. Keep very good documentation of any cost that you may incur. Really work with the forensic accounting to quantify a business interruption loss. That's the biggest piece where we see arguments. It's easily quantifiable of like, how much was the ransom payment? How much did the legal fees come in? Because we have all the invoices associated with that. The hardest part to quantify, and oftentimes what I see the biggest area of contention with insurers and policyholders is around, how did we get to the business interruption cost? How much did I really lose in income, revenue, or incur additional expenses? So making sure you're working with an organization to help you quantify that through documentation that an insurance carrier will accept. Because if I could write an email that says, I lost $1 million, they're going to want a decent amount of documentation to support that is something that you would have actually received in revenue for the week that the system was down. And if it was your busiest season of fundraising, you were in the middle of a capital campaign and you were on that final week, and that week of donations would look different than the week prior. So being able to create your business case is going to be really important, and having the right advisors to do that, because that's really I won't say it's the only area, but it is the area we see the most amount of discussion of, was I made whole from the insurance proceeds?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Oh, that's very helpful. So we have another question. I think it's great. We have a lot of decision makers that are responsible for cyber liability insurance on the webinar. But then there's also a big chunk of folks who I think maybe see the need to get this cyber liability insurance coverage, but maybe it's not in place. What are some ways that people can kind of make this business case to organizational leadership that this is something that is important and something that we should do as an organization?
So that's twofold. I think the first is understanding the threat landscape, where if your system was down, if your systems were down, what would be the repercussions and for how long could you go on with the system down? What does that look like? So that is number one value proposition for having the cyber insurance policy and all of the vendors that will help you, that will support you after a cyber attack. So understanding what your risk exposure is, understanding what your risk tolerance is for that event will help you either make the business case to buy cyber insurance or the business case for what limits and retentions you should buy. So some organizations, they're like, listen, we can do the small stuff. So I'm willing to take a higher retention so that my premium's lower, but I want to make sure I have access to all the vendors, and you'll still get that even if you take a higher retention. So those are sort of the knowing your threat landscape is certainly the most important thing. And then knowing if you have the controls in place to get a good insurance quote. Right. So going back to all the controls, the MFA and the trainings and everything we just talked about, making sure those two, you understand your risk profile and that you have all the controls in place, that's going to be the strongest submission to get a great quote from the insurance market.
I am so sorry to jump in because this has just been such a great hour, and I feel like we could talk for a lot longer about this, but I want to make sure that we remind everyone what our objectives were, that we, I think, have hit a lot of these objectives, that I understand a lot more about cyber insurance, the landscape, the risks, some of the lingo, where to go for more resources. So I just want to thank you so much, Jenna. I want to mention to everyone on the call right now that if we didn't get to your question, we will try to answer as many of those as we can in the transcript. So I want to invite everyone next month to our monthly webinar series. We're going to take a hard turn onto a different topic, SharePoint for nonprofits. And this is a joint webinar with Build Consulting and Steve Longenecker, who is our SharePoint expert here. And if you're thinking like SharePoint, like, I don't even know, do I use SharePoint? If you use Microsoft, you are sharing your file, you are storing and sharing your files in SharePoint. So this is a great webinar for you to come back to and just learn a little bit about setting up that architecture so that you can find what you're looking for and share it easily. And I just want to thank you again, Jenna, for sharing all of your expertise and knowledge with us. I actually was thinking when you were answering the question about how to convince a leader, show them this webinar and show them that slide with the threat landscape. And I think this just helped me understand so much more about it. And we just thank you again so much for spending your time with us. And thank you again, Jenna and Matt.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining this Community IT Podcast Part 2. You can find Part 1 in your podcast feed if you subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. Community IT does these free webinars and podcasts for our community, and we love sharing our knowledge and experience. If you have more questions or are having trouble with your IT at your nonprofit, please get in touch with us on our website, www.communityit.com, so we can start a conversation or schedule an assessment. Downloading any of our free resources there will get you signed up for our webinar reminders, and you can attend our next webinar in real time and ask our experts your own questions. If you love podcasts, please subscribe and leave us a rating to help others find this leadership resource for nonprofits.